3 a.m., the Pacific Ocean. Exhausted from a long day's training, the fighter jet pilot's eyes finally closed for good. The hull of the aircraft carrier groans comfortingly, pipes rumbling every now and then. An alarm screams to life. The pilot sits bolt upright so fast that he cracks his forehead against the bunk bed above him. Clutching the wound and trying to blink some life into his heavy eyes, he hops down from the bunk and staggers out of the room. Soldiers bustle in all directions around him, throwing on their uniforms as they go. The muscle memory that comes from years of training takes over, and the pilot's feet carry him in the direction he needs to go. All around him, the sleeping behemoth of a ship is waking up. The sound of machinery coming to life, making the very ground beneath his feet judder and shake with energy. The pipes that had been gently rumbling just a few minutes ago are now hissing and rattling. The blaring alarm drowns out soldiers' shouts to one another, so they have to gesture to each other from across the halls. And then, all of a sudden, fresh air hits his face. The pilot throws open the door and steps out onto the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. At 1,000 feet long, the ship still feels tiny compared to the vast ocean. Out on deck, the alarm is quieter. The red lights flashing have been replaced by moonlight. A gentle sea breeze tickles the pilot's face and carries that familiar salty sea smell to his nose. It's almost peaceful, except that alarm could only signal one thing: the end of decades of peace and the arrival of a third world war. The pilot is in the cockpit in no time, helmet on, oxygen connected, testing the flaps and glancing worriedly at the horizon. He's taxied onto the runway before he can collect himself and realize where he's going. Even though he's done it more times than he can count, taking off with an FA-18 never stops being terrifying. His runway is just a fraction of the length of the ones he trained on in his younger years, and at the end of it is the icy cold Pacific Ocean. Again, muscle memory takes over. He punches the throttle and feels the familiar G-forces pinning him to the back of his seat, pressing him into it until he feels the air squeezing out of his chest. The runway rumbles under his wheels for a few hundred feet and then disappears. The jet dips, but somehow the air catches it and he lifts the nose. The once enormous aircraft carrier is barely larger than an insect behind him in seconds. The afterburners roar in his ears as he glances out of the window to see a hulking shape just beneath the moonlit waves. A whale? No, it's too large. The water turns white and then parts, revealing multiple missiles shooting up into the sky. He had no clue they were even deployed in the area, left alone lurking within a kilometer of where he'd been sleeping. They'd only surface if… The pilot grits his teeth and looks toward the horizon as the Chinese mainland's glittering skyline crawls into view. And against the dark sky, he watches tiny white dots rise into the air, like shooting stars returning to space. Each little dot armed with a nuclear warhead on its way to a city he and his squad had once called home. Is China on the verge of starting a war? Some of the early warning signs are there, despite recent diplomacy between China and the US stabilizing following Donald Trump's attempts at inciting a trade war. However, it's not all straightforward. The last couple years have seen Beijing significantly ramping up its stockpiles of weapons and vehicles. In the National People's Congress in China, they announced they would be increasing military spending this year by 7%. Chinese President Xi Jinping is not an outspoken aggressor in the same mold as Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, but the numbers are there. China has not built up such a strong military force since the end of the Cold War. Xi Jinping is quick to downplay this military buildup as nothing more than the country preparing for worst-case and extreme scenarios. China is also increasing its stockpiles of food and fuel. In the event of a war breaking out, those resources would be the first to be targeted by economic sanctions. But the word war will not escape his lips. Instead, he argues that China must be ready to endure high winds, choppy waters, and even dangerous storms. What storms could he be talking about? Who would attack China? Well, no one. That's a common tactic we see regularly being trotted out by Russian President Vladimir Putin when discussing his invasion of Ukraine. When talking to the Russian people in his national addresses in the run-up to this year's presidential elections, Putin framed Russia as the victim. The economic sanctions they were suffering from, the external pressures from world leaders, etc., are all a kind of storm that the Russian people are having to endure. They are the victims, but they will get through if they hold it together. The reality of the situation is that he invaded a sovereign nation and his people are now facing the repercussions of his actions. China would not be facing a storm from invading nations, they would be the invaders. The conflict between China and Taiwan boils down to a fundamentally simple but seemingly insurmountable disagreement. Taiwan asserts that it is a sovereign nation with its own government, people, culture, and right to exist. China believes that Taiwan belongs to them and will soon be under Beijing's control once again, by force if necessary. The island of Taiwan is 100 miles from China, separated by the Taiwan Strait, but the pair have always been closely linked. China is Taiwan's biggest trading partner. Today, businesses and families straddle the water with a foot in both countries. Taiwan heavily relies on mainland China, yet asserts that it is independent. The reasoning for this is complicated. Taiwan has been passed between Chinese and Japanese rule throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. At the start of the Second World War, Taiwan was under Japanese control until the Japanese lost the war in 1945. The land was handed back to China. At the time, China was under the rule of General Chiang Kai-shek, but he found himself locked in a fierce battle with Mao Zedong's Communist Party. As we know, the Communists won in 1949, and Chiang fled the country, taking what was left of his party with him to Taiwan. His nationalist party was called the Kuomintang, often shortened to KMT, and they claimed to still be in control of the Republic of China, which included both Taiwan and the regions of mainland China under communist rule. Chiang asserted his democratic control over the whole of China for decades from Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, and was internationally recognized as the country's true leader on many fronts, including the United Nations, where he represented the nation until the 1970s. Chiang's government was a pseudo-democracy, as in reality it was only a one-party system. His goal was to build up a military force ready for an invasion of mainland China. He attempted to rally together those groups already rebelling against the Chinese Communist Party, such as the Uyghurs, a predominantly Muslim Chinese ethnic minority group who still face harsh persecution to this day in forced labor camps in cities like Xinjiang. In 1975, 26 years after Chiang fled to Taiwan, he died aged 87. From this point, the Chinese Communist Party steadily grew in power and influence while Taiwan shrunk. In 1979, the U.S. switched from referring to Taipei as the Chinese capital to Beijing, and since then, they've been walking a tightrope between the two sides of the conflict. Since then, China has cemented itself as the workshop of the world. Economic reform in 1978 paved the way for the country to industrialize rapidly at the turn of the 21st century. The year Chiang died in 1975, the Chinese GDP was $163 billion. By 2000, it was $1.2 trillion. By 2022, it was at $17.9 trillion, second only to the United States. Made in China can be seen on the vast majority of products sold in the 21st century. The Chinese Communist Party, somewhat ironically, has used capitalism to garner immense wealth and power on the international stage. Not only has their economic explosion allowed them to invest in one of the world's most formidable military forces, but they are also the crucial link in the world's supply chain. Practically every country on the planet relies on China for the production of basic goods. Everything from technology to medicine is now shipped from a port along the Chinese coast, traveling to all corners of the globe. This represents a kind of soft power. The strategy is key to Xi Jinping's attempts to take Taiwan back under his control. Survey data shows that the percentage of people in Taiwan who identify as Chinese has dropped from 26% in the early 1990s down to just 3% today. The number of people who identify as just Taiwanese, not Taiwanese Chinese, has shot up in that same period from 18% to over 60% today. An increasing sense of independence has been a consistent trend in the country for decades. Xi Jinping's strategy to undo that has historically been to use soft power as his first port of call. Chinese trade, Chinese messaging in the media, and various peaceful tactics to encourage framing the idea of a reunification as a positive thing. Xi is well versed in this kind of manipulation. In 2019, BBC journalists took to the streets of China with the famous photograph of the man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square in 1989. This was the day when hundreds or even thousands of anti-government protesters were massacred in the square. The BBC journalist could not find a single person who would even acknowledge that they recognized the photograph, let alone talk about what it was of. The Chinese Communist Party is well versed in controlling narratives and shaping the minds of their people. However, as the survey data from Taiwan shows, it doesn't seem to be working there. Stronger actions are proving more necessary for China to regain ownership of the island. Xi is not opposed to making the occasional military threat, but this year in particular seems to have marked a definite shift in the air. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have consistently conducted patrols in the Taiwan Strait. While precise figures are elusive, they're estimated to deploy hundreds of patrol vessels. These substantial vessels, with some displacing up to 5,000 tons of water, painted a distinctive bright white hue Adorned with red and navy stripes along the bow, these ships are easily visible from afar, even from the horizon. These white ships patrol the strait day and night, always visible to Taiwanese fishermen. Tensions have existed for years, but in early 2024, they were ratcheted up another level. 2 Chinese fishermen drowned after being chased by a Taiwanese patrol vessel. China's response was to redouble their patrols. Taiwanese fishermen who were once comfortable fishing where they wished now have to steer well clear of any Chinese vessels for fear of retaliation. But even these large Chinese patrol vessels will now keep an eye on the horizon, as a fleet of ships that make them look like children's toys are steadily arriving one by one. In 2024, the United States is expected to deploy half of its aircraft carriers to the waters just outside China's doorstep. The U.S. Navy currently has 11 aircraft carriers in its service. This doesn't necessarily sound like that many until you realize that there are only 21 aircraft carriers in the world. The U.S. has over half of them. The remaining 10 are owned by the UK, India, Italy, France, Russia, and China. As of now, the U.S. has 3 aircraft carriers in Asian waters. By the end of the year, they're projected to send another 2 carriers to bolster that lineup. Most carriers are named after former U.S. presidents, such as the USS Abraham Lincoln or the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. The current fleet has all been Nimitz-class ships, serving alongside the lead ship of the same name, but that is set to change over the coming decades. The U.S. has ramped up its production of aircraft carriers since 2013, with 10 more on the way over the coming years under the new Gerald R. Ford class. The lead ship of the new fleet, the USS Gerald R. Ford itself, is the largest warship ever constructed. Powered by a pair of Bechtel A-1B PWR nuclear reactors, its range is virtually unlimited. Launched in 2022, it'll be in service for the next 50 years. It carries a crew of 2,600 with a complement of 508 officers and 3,789 enlisted. It has 3 Phalanx close-in weapon systems, 4 guided missile launchers, and 4 28mm machine guns. Its deck can hold over 75 aircraft. One of these ships alone is a moving fortress capable of intimidating any army on the planet, and the U.S. has 9 more of these under construction for the coming decades. So, when the U.S. decided to start gathering these aircraft carriers near China in early 2024, it was to send a very serious message. We mentioned earlier that the U.S. has been walking a tightrope between China and Taiwan since 1979. The tightrope line appears to be wearing thin nowadays, making it harder and harder for the U.S. to balance between the two. Only 12 countries, including Vatican City, recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation globally. Those are Belize, Guatemala, Haiti, Holy See, Marshall Islands, Palau, Paraguay, St. Lucia, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Eswatini, and Tuvalu. Notice that none of these are global superpowers. The United States and countries from the EU are noticeably absent from the list. Taiwan has very few allies in an official sense. This is due mainly to China's aforementioned ties to the global economy. The People's Republic of China, i.e. mainland communist China, refuses to have diplomatic relations with any nation that recognizes Taiwan's independence. However, countries are allowed to have non-political ties with Taiwan, meaning that there are several international quasi-embassies in Taiwan from foreign nations and vice versa. The United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, India, Pakistan, and Canada all signed on to the One China policy, under which the PRC is the one and only Chinese government and nation. The wording here gets us into a very delicate diplomatic language. The U.S. acknowledges that Taiwan is independent, but it does not recognize it. Like we said, a very thin tightrope. Despite the United Nations recognizing Chiang's Taipei government from the 1960s through to the 1970s, due to its anti-communist slant, it was eventually forced to concede that the Communist Party does control China. Yet Taiwan still exists as a thorn in the giant's side. So why does the US care about Taiwan at all? Again, it's complicated. Most of East Asia was in ruins at the end of the Second World War. Japan was reeling from the shock of 2 nuclear attacks, and the Chinese military and the government were stretched thin and fractured in many places. North and South Korea were locked in a conflict between 2 opposing governments, one communist and the other capitalist, which continues to this day. And the same thing was happening in Vietnam. The US, due to their response to Pearl Harbor and attacks on the Eastern Front, was inherently tied to all of these conflicts. To the American people, communism seemed to pose the next great existential threat. It had taken over Russia and China and could soon take over the world. The ideologies posed were seen as antithetical to the freedoms and the open markets that had seen the US become the powerhouse it was after the war. If they allowed East Asia to fall entirely into communism, it would make China and the USSR, the sources of much of the communist push, incredibly powerful and a real threat. So the US decided to fight back, arming national leaders sympathetic to American ideals, and in some cases putting boots on the ground in support to fight proxy wars across the region. This was the Cold War in a nutshell. A particular group of nations was seen as key military targets for the US, the so-called First Island Chain. This was the string of islands close to mainland China that, if the US could have a military foothold in or alliance with, would give them a strategic advantage in a potential war between the two nations. These are all nations that the US has invested heavily in since the end of the Second World War and fostered close diplomatic ties. The countries in the chain are Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and crucially Taiwan. The smallest and likely weakest of the four, Taiwan is also closest to Chinese soil and not far at all from Hong Kong, another partially westernized pocket in the region, far enough south from the Chinese supercities along and near the northern coast, and with possible backing from Hong Kong, a potential invading force from Taiwan could get a foothold on the mainland in a hypothetical case of a full-scale invasion attempt on Chinese soil. At this point, the more likely scenario seems to be the opposite, an invasion from mainland China onto Taiwan. CIA Director William Burns has made a grim prediction in this department. He expects Xi to invade Taiwan by 2027. This poses two questions: why now, and how can we tell? In answer to the first, China's economy may be starting to plateau. The rampant growth we've seen yearly since 2000 is leveling off. China's GDP did not grow substantially from 2021 to 2022 and is expected not to have fared much better across the following years. Industrializing countries can often enjoy sharp growth for a period, but eventually, as they shift their economies towards service and away from industry, the economy can level off. China is having to spend more on its citizens, standards of living have increased, and with them healthcare and social services costs. For years, China has sustained its industry on very low-paid workers. This has been a big draw from foreign investors so they can make their goods for less in China. This has steadily started to change. They also have an aging population, which means a slowdown in the number of workers available to sustain continued growth. Add to this the fact that China did not spring back from the COVID pandemic as predicted, and you have a recipe for the early faltering steps of a slowing economy. And this is not to say that China is on the verge of economic collapse, but rather that this could mark the end of their golden era and transition into a new, more steady service-based economy with a stronger middle class and reduced industry. So why now? Well, it could be Xi's best chance. With China's economy slowing, Xi might want to strike while the iron is hot. Rather than risk China declining or being outpaced by competitors, he wants to capitalize on its status as an unquestionable top 2 global superpower. There's more to it as well. Following Putin's invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that the Chinese government supports, and the invasion of Gaza by Israeli forces in 2023, a precedent has been set around the world. Despite Ukraine having close ties with the West and on the doorstep of the EU, no other countries have done anything to defend the nation other than sending weapons and aid. The US and NATO as a whole have not put boots on the ground to stop Putin from taking Ukraine. In Gaza, it's a similar story. No other nation wants to get involved. Following Vietnam, the Cold War, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and countless other conflicts, the West has become hesitant to wade into foreign conflicts in the way they once would have. On top of this, a lot of military spending is being funneled into sending aid to these countries. The US has directed roughly $75 billion to Ukraine so far in this war. Even for a country as rich as the US, that is no small sum. The United States' eyes are torn between watching Ukraine, Gaza, and the Houthi strikes in the Red Sea. Then, of course, there's always Kim Jong-un's threats from North Korea, as well as domestic problems all across the US in a run-up to another presidential election. It's possible that under the chaos of these conflicts, Xi is planning to catch the US at a moment that they're stretched too thin. And this, experts believe, is the precise reason for the US sending so many aircraft carriers to China's doorstep. It's a clear message back to Xi Jinping that even though they're engaged across the world, they still have enough military strength to defend Taiwan if necessary. That leads us to our next question: would the US step in to defend Taiwan? Well, there is one country you need to speak to find out the answer to that question, And surprisingly, it is not the US. Since the end of the Second World War, the US and Japan have been working in partnership. One of the fundamental agreements that the two nations have with each other is the presence of US military bases on Japanese soil. The US has heavily invested in this type of strategy. Across the world, they have over 750 military bases in around 80 countries. As a result, the US military has grown a truly global presence. In the event of war anywhere in the world, they do not have to ship soldiers for days on end just to get to the front lines, and they are likely already within arm's reach. In the case of Taiwan, these bases are in Japan. So regardless of whether the US government agrees internally about sending soldiers to help defend Taiwan, they first have to get the all-clear from the Japanese government. Any US bases on Japanese soil would be the targets of Chinese airstrikes. Even in the best-case scenario, collateral damage would spill out and impact Japan's 127 million citizens. They would likely want a say in what is happening. Given that Japan has been staunchly neutral since the events of World War II, it's not a guarantee that they would side with the US and allow themselves to be dragged into another war, no matter how good international relations are. The next port of call would be South Korea, which hosts many US military bases, but this would be a different issue. North and South Korea are locked in a fierce stalemate in a war that's still officially going to this day. On either side of the DMZ, there are lines and lines of long-range missiles pointed at one another's capital. If the US was granted permission to launch attacks on the Chinese military from there, China would well give Kim Jong-un permission to launch his attacks on the South. Remember, Chinese military officials were pictured at North Korea's military displays last year. Launching attacks from here could set off a domino line of events that would plunge the entirety of Asia into a conflict. So let's consider a hypothetical. China launches an attack on Taiwan. How would it play out? As much as the US has been sending weapons to Taiwan for decades now and steadily bolstering its military, it still does not hold a candle to the size and strength of the Chinese army. China has a total active force of just over 2 million, while Taiwan can only muster 169,000, less than a tenth. This discrepancy extends to practically every metric between the two armies. China vastly outnumbers Taiwan in every way. It will likely start with China continuing to do what they're doing now, steadily pushing the goalposts further and further. A patrol may pass within 5 kilometers of Taiwan and could pass within 4.5 the next day. Jet patrols could take to the sky doing laps of the borders of Taiwanese airspace, just slightly encroaching more and more each time. This is what Putin was doing in the run-up to invading Ukraine. Russian military units near the border were moving fences that were supposed to mark the border by a few meters daily. On the world stage, Xi Jinping assures everyone there's nothing to see here, and that it's simply Chinese soldiers on Chinese soil running exercises and monitoring dangerous rebel groups. The US and NATO will firmly assure China that any escalation will be opposed, but it'll not commit to saying what their opposition will look like. According to them, and almost all of the international community, Taiwan is their own land, so this is well within their rights. They'll push up a little further each time, make the Taiwanese defenses sweat, and second-guess when the actual invasion is going to happen. Then, one day, it will. China will have already squeezed its way so close that it'll be able to invade in an instant. A cyber attack on a technically advanced scale never seen before will overwhelm Taiwan's core infrastructure, leaving the country immobilized. Chinese ships will sever undersea cables that link Taiwan's islands together and connect them to the internet. Missiles will hurtle toward government buildings, military outposts, and critical infrastructure. Within hours, the entire country will be crippled to the point of partial defeat. Soldiers will be forced to engage in guerrilla warfare, launching ambushes and sneak attacks that they have spent their entire military careers training for. This is where the real war will begin. Assuming the Taipei government does not heed China's demands, they'll enter a protracted and bloody engagement designed to whittle Taiwan's resolve and military strength steadily. At this point, Taiwan will have only one route to survival: holding out and waiting for foreign intervention. They will be utterly dependent on the United States to not only send them aid and weapons, but also actively engage in combat. Those hulking aircraft carriers lurking on the horizon need to make a choice. Will they deploy their forces or sit and watch as the people of Taiwan fight a losing war for their survival? Let's say the US engages. They've persuaded Japan to allow them to conduct limited military operations from Japanese soil solely to defend Taiwan from invasion. US jets would engage Chinese fighters in the air. Marines would fight to hold strategic locations by land, and the US Navy would use anti-air weapons to defend Taiwan from strikes. How long until the US is forced to push China back to engage them on their own land? That assumes that US intervention has not already kick-started a wider conflict between the two nations. If this war were to escalate even to the point of US and Chinese soldiers fighting one another, it would be paving the way for a third world war. Chinese allies, Russia and North Korea, would likely seize the opportunity to advance into territories guarded by the US. Japan would also be dragged into the war, and South Korea would likely be too. Other nations with historical tensions between the two sides, like Vietnam, could find themselves taking sides. In the Middle East, countries and military groups carrying out anti-US sentiment, stirred up by decades of conflict, could take the opportunity to launch bigger and more audacious attacks. The US would need to call on NATO for support, but it would get incredibly complicated. With so many conflicts from so many angles, what would NATO do to help? And what should they stay out of? And hanging over all of this is the biggest threat of all: the world's nuclear superpowers being engaged in active war against one another. The last time nuclear weapons were fired, it was intended to end a world war. How long would it take before a country decided to do the same again? Only this time, what would be stopping their enemy from retaliating? That's a lot to think about. So let's take a step back and think about all this from start to finish. Do you believe any of this is actually likely to happen? In 2011, Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker published a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. In it, he argued that we live in the most peaceful period in human history. While we may look at the news each day and see countless people dying from wars raging all across the planet and think the world is in ruins, it's just our exposure to those things that have increased. Rewind a couple centuries and the world was in worse shape, but we saw less of it without the internet, international news, and instant global communication. This argument has been thrown around as fact for the last decade. We live in the most peaceful period in human history. It reflects a view of the world that we believe is true. As a species gets smarter, more connected, and more wealthy, we become less violent. Our ancestors' living conditions necessitated their violence, conditions that we have improved and outgrown, meaning that we can lay down our arms and enjoy peaceful lives. Pinker argues that while we might sit at home watching horrific acts of violence and war on the evening news, the reality of our situation is that we are most likely sitting in a comfortable home in a city that is not being bombarded with artillery. Wars are the minority, but tend to fill our imaginations. But is Steven Pinker right? Much of his argument is based on the trend of declining death rates as a percentage of the population. Years ago, war could wipe out 20% of a nation's population, but now it might only be 2%. This difference, however, is that the world's population has exploded over the last 100 years alone. That 20% figure could be 500,000 people in the past, but now 2% could be over 1 million. We have smaller armies proportionally to the overall population, but who wield weapons capable of leveling entire cities in hours without putting a single pair of boots on the ground. We have nuclear weapons pointed at each other's capitals, capable of inflicting so much damage in one blast that they would wildly throw off Pinker's statistics on wartime deaths for an entire generation. Now go check out What If China Attacked Russia, or watch this video instead.